think, Marge. All I need is a title.
We have come to the climax of the Exodus story, the part where God has led the Israelites out of Egypt after dealing with Pharaoh and his armies at the Red Sea. Now they sit at the base of Mount Sinai, where Moses goes up the mountain to receive the laws of God. My first real problem with this part of the story comes here, as the people of Israel are quickly deceived into donating their golden jewelry to go toward the sculpting of the golden calf to be their god and idol, simply because Moses is taking too long in talking to God. You might think that these people might have more patience, considering that Moses is up on this holy mountain talking to God. This isn't like you're talking to your next door neighbor here. After a few days, I might think that something interesting is going to come out of all of this. After 10 or so, I might be expecting major news. After 20, that news had better be really impactful. And after 40, it better be earth-shaking. And the divulging of an entirely new legal code handed down by God himself certainly qualifies. My second problem dovetails into the first. Not only did the people know where Moses was and what he was doing, but they also could not have forgotten their not-so-distant past. They could not have forgotten that they had been held captive in slavery only a few weeks before. Slavery is a pretty traumatic experience, and it would not be one that you would forget so quickly. Not to mention the fact that Moses was able to call upon the power of God to bring about the plagues upon the Egyptians, and then demolish Pharaoh's entire army by drowning them in the Red Sea. Now Moses goes up onto Mount Sinai and is gone a few days, and the people think they've been abandoned. And so they want to go back into slavery in Egypt? What complete fools! And even when I was a believer, this was the stupidest aspect of the story as far as I was concerned. This is, however, the beginning of what will become a pattern throughout the narrative books of the Old Testament. Israel starts off as obedient to God, but the people are then led astray. They seem to forget everything that has happened to them and start sinning. God then punishes them, and they come back into his favor. It all makes me wonder who in this relationship was the insane one who kept doing the same thing over and over again, but apparently was hoping for a different result. So Moses brings the people to Mount Sinai, and he heads up the mountain to receive God's laws for his people. What he'd returned with was a series of proclamations that would not fit on 2 stone tablets, at least not the size that could be carried, and these so-called commandments are problematic at best. Let's spotlight the problems as we review each of the commandments. Even given that this was meant for a specific audience, namely the people of Israel, God comes across as really petty and jealous. The problem here is that jealousy has to have a target. One does not simply become jealous over nothing or no one. This tells me that at least on some level, the Jews writing the book of Exodus looked out over the cultural landscape and wanted to separate themselves from their older gods from Zoroastrianism, as well as the gods worshipped by the Babylonians or any of the other surrounding cultures that the Jews would have had contact with. This edict sets out to make any god except Yahweh pretty much illegal, and it also admits that there are other gods out there. Well, as we humans know quite well, the first step toward resolving a personal problem is admitting that you have one. Hello, I'm God and I'm jealous. And then, of course, from the assembled angels, nether entities, and other whatevers, we would hear, "Hi, God!" Aron Ra did an excellent job of pulling this edict apart and explaining the Jewish cultural reasons behind this particular prohibition. So let's see what he had to say on this matter.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Second clause. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers unto the children of the 3rd and 4th generations of them that hate me, and showing mercy to the thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. This is the stick and the carrot again. Believe our ridiculous nonsense, or else. That's the law of Abrahamic religion. If you're Jewish, you would interpret this to mean that you're supposed to obey all 10 commandments, including the fourth one. Most Americans would interpret this to mean that you're not supposed to worship false gods. But how can you tell which ones are the false ones? Everyone who has a belief in a god thinks everyone else's pantheon as the false ones, right? But it doesn't tell you that you're not supposed to worship these renderings. It tells you you're not allowed to create them at all, regardless whether you intended to worship them or not. Thou shalt not make any engraving of any, or any likeness in any medium of anything that is in heaven and earth. Now, presumably, they're only talking about recognizable things like animals or plants or trees or what have you. In which case, abstract art is permissible only by omission, and what this is saying is it is against God's law to draw a picture or paint or sculpt or create any likeness of anything, any living thing at least, if not other things like chariots and helmets and so on, perhaps even maps. That means that any artistic rendering of any kind is forbidden. That is what it says, and it's obviously what it means, but virtually no one obeys this particular commandment. Only the most extreme, barking lunatics could, and I only ever met one who did. Otherwise, the only way to revere this is to interpret it to mean what it does not say, which is a common Christian tradition.
First off, how convenient that God is writing this law at the very moment that the people of Israel were violating it. You could have saved Moses a whole lot of work on chiseling the replacement set of tablets if he had simply taken some initiative and lightning bolted the sinners right at that point. But the idea, as Aron Ra pointed out, was not only did God want no other gods before him, he also did not want anyone creating an idol that you could possibly breathe the breath of life into and it would become a living being. I would like to point out that both Judaism and Islam have versions of this prohibition in common, although people in both faiths practice it to varying degrees. This indicates the closeness of the two competing religions to each other, despite what each might say about it. Perhaps this edict is followed in the more fundamentalist sects in Judaism, but most people don't bother. It is more an issue in Islam, where depictions of the pedophile prophet Muhammad might get someone killed, depending on who is offended.
Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain.
The NIV version of this says, "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord," which to me makes more sense, despite the fact that no one gives a damn flying fuck about this particular demand. Here's a serious question. If you lie under oath, are you breaking one commandment or two, the third and the ninth? It'd be bad enough to be punished by the human court system, but God's going to hit you for violating two of his commandments. And God is pretty hot on the lightning bolts about this sort of thing. In a sense, this edict is also establishing a thought crime, because first you have to have the reaction that elicits the thought, and then you speak that thought. We'll see a couple times in these commandments where the Jewish writers want to police the thoughts of the people.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
Well, first off, no one can agree on what day the Sabbath is on. For Muslims it is Friday, for Jews it is Saturday, and for Christians it is Sunday. That is quite a few days where people are begging off from work because their invisible sky daddy told them to take a religious day. Also, what constitutes work? The way the rabbinical laws have worked out, some people consider anything above breathing to be work, and therefore a sin. That being said, is having sex considered work? Come on, people, this is ridiculous. Lighting a match is considered work. Basically, God is saying, go do whatever you want on 6 days of the week, but on that 7th day, everything in your society had better come to a screeching fucking halt. And by the way, if lighting a candle is considered work, what about an internal combustion engine? It looks like all you people going to church on Sunday are violating at least one commandment.
Honor thy father and thy mother.
This one just stupidly ignores human nature in that some parents are good and deserve some respect, while others should not have had the children that they did and deserve no respect whatsoever for the fact that the father copulated inside of the mother and the two of them manufactured an individual that could then be abused for the next 15 years or so of its life. Put simply, respect is earned both ways. However, this edict hides a rather dark side of the Jewish culture, an extreme form of the children should be seen and not heard BS that a lot of abusive adults supported some years back. Aron Ra explains this.
Getting back to the topic, we haven't read the whole commandment. It goes on to say, Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And now let's forget for a moment that according to this story, and it is just a story, even rabbinical scholars now admit that the Exodus was not an actual historic event. Let's forget that God promised to his chosen people land that already belonged to someone else. Both the Jewish and Christian versions of God are apparently ethnocentric racists. Jesus himself was Jewish, and he denied his lessons and his blessings to those of other races who he criticized, comparing them to dogs. Much the same with his alleged father Jehovah, who sent an angel into the promised land to drive out a half a dozen tribes who already lived there in favor of his chosen people. This commandment could be read as, honor your father and thy mother so that you will live a long life. Because remember, this was a culture that permitted parents to murder disobedient children. So you'd better show some respect, because it was legal for fathers to say, I brought you into this world, I'll take you out, make another one look just like you.
So the fifth commandment sanctions child abuse and, in extreme cases, child murder. Except when God tells you to do it, then it must be fine. In fact, God later sets about putting down laws and rules saying when it is okay for someone or the state to murder someone as punishment for some other crime. And some of these crimes are pretty stupid. We'll cover some of these rules and laws once we get to these later books. But it is safe to say that we don't follow these laws saying that we are to murder someone as punishment for what society now considers the norm. This demand is also common sense. It certainly didn't take God to come up with it. In fact, the earliest recorded legal code that criminalizes murder to this point is the Code of Ur-Nammu, which was written at about roughly 2100 to 2050 BC. The book of Exodus was written during the Jewish captivity in Babylon, sometime roughly between 600 and 501 BC. I would say that this commandment is common sense because, for the most part, killing someone diminishes everyone involved. Of course, one person is dead, but society in general is also harmed, and the person committing the murder is psychologically corrupted, even if the murder was justified, as in wartime, self-defense, and capital punishment, all of which are sanctioned elsewhere in this section of the Bible.
Thou shalt not commit adultery.
This edict is another thought crime, and it's particularly bad because you have to ask, at what point does adultery become courtship? Aron Ra points out that it is actually a lot easier to commit adultery today, because back in the times of the ancient Hebrews, men had the right to own slaves and concubines and could sleep with them as he wished. The slaves counted as property, and so it didn't matter, and concubines counted as legal prostitutes that were not part of the family and could not inherit the estate after the man died. What this law really says is, thou shalt not have sex with a woman who is married. But Christians take this edict and run off the face of the planet with it, basically saying that unless you intend to court this woman that you are busy looking at, you are committing adultery. This is actually one of the few times where the Christians are more heavy-handed than the ancient Hebrews. Someone needs to lighten up. Except again where God commands it, such as during the Exodus from Egypt when the Hebrews were allowed to go borrow whatever they wanted for their trip out of the country, of course knowing that they would not be coming back to return the property. How about all the property stolen by the Hebrews as they conquered the so-called land of Canaan? And I say it like that because the information we presented in Atheist Bible Study number 9. The tribes of Israel came into the land, they killed pretty much anyone they wanted to kill, most of the time on orders from God, and then there was all this property laying around. Sure, the Hebrews sought out the remaining family members and gave them the property as sort of a reparation for having massacred the rest of the family in the community. And I dare you to try finding that anywhere in the Bible, because that would go against everything that happens in the upcoming story. It is interesting that God upholds the cultural standards of warfare. It would have been quite different and perhaps more in tune with the version of God that Christians worship today if the commands had been, go into this new land, conquer it, but save as many people as you can and integrate them into your society, so that more people may worship me. However, God proves himself to be just as barbaric as the people that are supposed to worship him, and signs off on all of the killing and theft that comes about later in the narrative about the ancient Hebrews.
Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor.
Most Most often, people will say that this edict forbids lying. I imagine that at no point was there any person living just after these edicts were handed down, or today, that hasn't lied. One problem with the commandment, as people think it reads, is that it's too broad. Honesty is not always good, and lying is not always evil. If you are kidnapped, your first duty is to yourself and your survival, and all of these commandments can go out the window. Being honest in this situation might just get you killed, but at least you're not sinning. In actuality, this edict is a prohibition against slander, so it's actually one of the meekest of the 10 Commandments. However, Christians do this all the time when they assert that something is true without having a shred of evidence for it. We'll leave out the whole belief in the Supreme Being for a moment because God would not put forward an edict that would essentially delegitimize himself. However, Christians will often say things about what atheists believe or what atheists might do, such as, well, without God you have no morals, and without morals you would just go around killing and raping people. That statement is patently false, unjust, and untrue to the point of slander. Yet Christians who are trying to win arguments with atheists will often use this line of bullshit to try to make themselves look better, because no one, including atheists, wants to be the bad guy.
Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's.
This edict reveals that either God or the Jewish writers of the Exodus believed in communism, or they didn't have a clue about human nature, because seeing and desiring what another person has might motivate someone to work toward getting that thing or completing that achievement. I'm pretty sure whoever's responsible for this demand, another thought crime by the way, simply did not understand human nature, which is interesting in two ways. First, if God created humans, then he would have known about this urge to want bigger and better things, or at least to live more comfortably. An all-knowing God would have seen any difficulties with this coming a mile off, and might have designed a world where coveting simply wasn't necessary. Second, it seems weird for the Jewish intellectuals who were writing this series of books in the Bible would include this edict in the 10 Commandments, except as a way of controlling people. And I say this because look at their situation as they were writing this book. They were captives, slaves again, this time in Babylon. Don't covet your neighbor's stuff? Why not? They certainly might have better things than you do. This particular edict, I think, did a lot more harm than good, because in effect it says that you should be happy with your station in life, your possessions, and so on, and should make no attempt to better yourself or your situation based on what someone else has. So at what point did the Hebrew slaves of Egypt covet the freedom of their captors?
Written with the finger of God.
Before going further, I would like to point out that apparently the Jewish writers lost track of the story, because just after stating this first set of commandments, the Hebrews tell Moses to have God speak to them through him, because if God were to speak to them directly, they would die. Possibly of boredom, but who knows? Yet not too far in the future, they seem to forget all about God and Moses and decide to create the golden calf. I'm sorry, but if you are impressed enough by something to think that being near enough to it to have it speak to you might kill you, how do you then go, even within the space of 40 days, to forgetting all about that? All of this points out how ignorant and stupid the entire story is. What an inept group of people, whether they be the ancient Hebrews in the story or the Jews in Babylon writing it, that they could go through everything that they go through in the story. They escape from Egypt, being led by a charismatic leader and an active and vengeful God on their side. They reach the mountain, and the leader goes to talk with this same God, and within barely a month, the people just seem to forget about all of this.
Shut up! That's dust! Morons! I'm surrounded by morons!
I won't go into the second batch of laws, the ones actually labeled the Ten Commandments, which don't actually happen for another 14 chapters. The intervening space is dedicated with the first batch of laws over the people. Most of the time, however, it is spent telling the people exactly how to build this or that regarding the priesthood, and setting up all sorts of rules regarding how the people should act with the priests and the tabernacle and the temple and such. This took a little over an additional 600 laws to codify all of this, which may have given the people an excuse to create the golden calf, just saying. Now, I won't go into the whole song and dance surrounding the golden calf because we did that earlier. Suffice it to say that neither God nor Moses was happy about this. And Moses comes down the mountain and sees what the people have done, which sets up the best scene in the entire movie.
That gathers against you, Moses. You take too much upon yourself. We will not live by your commandments. We're free.
There is no freedom without the law.
Whose law, Moses? Yours? Did you carve those tablets to become a prince over us?
Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me.
The people made me do. He showed you no land flowing with milk and honey. I'll show you a God of gold. Come with me. Follow me.
Blasphemers, idolaters, for this you shall drink bitter waters. God has set before you this day his laws of life and good and death and evil. Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
Except that there was nothing in the Bible about what Moses said as he threw the tablets. The golden calf was destroyed, apparently crushed into such a fine powder that it was mixed with water and the people were forced to drink it. Those who weren't bolted to death immediately by an angry God, or killed by the plague the Lord unleashed later. This was in spite of his immediate reaction, which was to wipe out the Hebrews entirely and start over, this time with Moses, perhaps doing a cult of personality tribe-like thing. Moses, however, is able to get God to change his mind by pointing out that the Egyptians would laugh if they knew that the Hebrews had been led into the wilderness only to be slaughtered by their God. Leaving aside the question of how the Egyptians would discover this, this is an example of a never-changing God changing his mind. And this is at least twice during the first two books of the Bible where we see God changing his mind. God is still not done punishing the people. It is decided that none of this generation of Hebrews will be allowed to enter Canaan. So the people wander around for 40 years until this generation has died off, except apparently for Moses, his wife, his brother Aaron, and Joshua, who will lead the assault on the people living in the land of Canaan. And remember, Aaron was the one who made the golden calf, then lied about being forced to do so. He gave the people the instructions, and then did the deed. Overall, Exodus and the Ten Commandments are stories that are a confusing mess. Scientifically, no archaeological evidence has been found of a mass migration of what would have been millions of people out of Egypt. There is no evidence that such a group of people wandered around that area of the Middle East for 40 years, and in fact, there is no evidence that the ancient Hebrews were ever enslaved in Egypt in the first place. Both secular scholars such as Ashraf, Ezzat, and rabbinical scholars have come to agree that the biblical Exodus did not happen the way it was depicted in the Bible, if it happened at all. In fact, Ezzat argues rather convincingly that the land the Hebrews called Canaan was actually located in northern Yemen and southwestern Arabia. He also argues that the Hebrews had contact with Egypt because one of the main trade routes ran through the area and because Hebrew pirates prowled the Red Sea. Ezzat states that Egypt had not had any contact with any organized tribe, nation, or kingdom in the area of Palestine, and that none of the cities mentioned in the conquest of the land, including Jerusalem, existed yet, because the land was essentially a barren waste. Instead, it was the Hebrew piracy and the interference with the trade routes that eventually led the Babylonians to move in and take care of the situation. But that is a story for a later episode of the Atheist Bible Studies.
Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish, where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you. He loves you. He loves you, and he needs money. He always needs money.
You think you're tough. Your heart is stone. You think you're tough. I'll call your blood. You think you're tough. I'll call your blood. You think you're tough.